Hi, welcome everybody to our Bring Our Billions Jobs Not War Forum. Thank you for coming. And I think we're going to start off with our panel. And the first speaker is Zoltan Grossman, who's a professor at Evergreen, and he's going to be speaking about military bases in the world.
Well, thanks everyone for coming. I just came from Occupy Olympia, and there was a demonstration which is probably still going on at Bank of America. You might have heard of Bank of America in the last few weeks. And I think there's a lot of talk about the banks, about financial institutions, about the financial crisis. I don't hear a lot about the military budget. I think it's kind of percolating up through the movement, and I think that this is a really golden opportunity to bring some of these issues about military spending. So I really appreciate that this event has been put on. I hope that Occupy Olympia, Occupy Seattle, Occupy Portland takes up some of these issues and really starts pointing towards the military. And in particular, I think military bases, because as Carrie said, it's kind of shocking how little people know about our global military bases network and how much it's become a target and how much it's become an extension of U.S. empire that is actually turning many of the local people and even local governments against the United States. So just wanted to do a very brief overview. This is, I've done a program at Evergreen called People's Geography of American Empire, which looks at all the way from Manifest Destiny through the Philippine Wars, if you've seen the new movie, John Sayles' movie Amigo, out to Vietnam, to the Middle East. This is really a story of the progression of the frontier, and the modern frontier, instead of being the old Indian forts, the army forts, it's foreign military bases. So next to the U.S. nuclear monopoly, there's no more universally recognized symbol of the nation's superpower status than its overseas basing system. So I think out of the JCS office, the Joint Chiefs of Staff office, this is a really accurate view. And when we look at the military bases established in the last 10 years alone, it's a vast extension, a vast historical extension of the basing network that's unprecedented since World War II. So many of these countries, if we're looking at 1990, did not have U.S. military bases. And that's part of what I want to talk about. And also just the sheer scale of what we're talking about. This is satellite photos of Iraq, and here's the Tigris and Euphrates. If you look at that dot right there, you can actually see it when you see the entire nation of Iraq. So let's zoom in on that little dot in the river valley. This is Balad Air Base. Welcome to Balad Air Base in Iraq, which was built with Soviet help by Saddam's government, taken over by the United States in the invasion. This area here is dominated by Kellogg Brown and Root, former subsidiary of Halliburton, the private contractors we hear so much about. It's called KBR land. And if we zoom in a little more on some of the Chinook helicopters like we see going overhead, you can see some of the craters left by the insurgent attacks. So many mortar attacks on this base that the soldiers themselves call it Mortaritaville. And when we're talking about the withdrawal from Iraq, the much celebrated withdrawal from Iraq at the end of the year, that is covering military forces, combat forces. The private contractors would stay. Many of the aircraft, the drones, would be able to go in and out of Iraq. So we're kind of returning to the situation of 1991 to 2003, between the two wars, when of course there was a continuous war within Iraq. So whether or not the U.S. is actually withdrawing from these bases, I think is open to question. So looking at the costs, and that's really what this event is about. So I looked up some of the latest accurate, I'd say there's also some figures from 2009, which I think they jimmied with statistics, but looking at about 823 bases outside the U.S. and its territories, not including Iraq and Afghanistan, which is counted separately. So if you add all those up, we've got over 1,000, a little over 1,000 bases. And it costs about $102 billion a year just to maintain those bases. There was a proposal at one time to close about 200 bases, and that would save something like 20 billion a year, we're talking about, not overall. 86 in U.S. territories, such as Guam is a good example, and many thousands on the U.S. mainland, about 700 of them I would call major bases. So that's somewhat of the figures, but that figure of over 1,000 bases and over 100 billion to maintain them should be repeated over and over and over again in the Occupy movement, so people understand the drain that this is having on the economy. It's not even a matter of winding down wars, it's a matter of withdrawing these bases. So purposes of bases obviously are to project force, also to listen in on the particular region. A good example being new bases in Africa serving as listening posts, positioning supplies, as we have at Fort Lewis, or JBLM, Joint Base Lewis and McChord, training and munitions testing, and a lot of other things, a lot of other functions of bases. I think one of the most important purpose of bases is political, is to serve as tripwires, either a military tripwire to put troops in a sense in harm's way, so if there is some kind of a crisis, there will be backing from the U.S. public to defend those troops from whatever that crisis is. But also as a political tripwire where if there's any change in the government or a rebel movement or some kind of disputed election, the U.S. automatically has an interest in it because it has a base there. And it, in a sense, reserves the right to interfere in that country's internal affairs because the outcome might have an effect on the presence of the bases. And as we saw in the invasion of Panama 22 years ago, it's easier to invade a country if you already have some bases there. So in a sense, the troops are being used as tripwires, as to set up a potential sacrifice in order to make it easier to intervene in that country. I think that's one of the main aims of bases. And wherever we're talking about in the world, there tends to be an economic gap between the local citizens and Americans. In Europe, it's actually the reverse. There's actual tensions between Americans and some local businesses. Obviously, there's, in places like the Philippines historically, Thailand, there's been racism by U.S. troops towards the local population. In Europe, sometimes it's African American GIs who are victims of racism by Europeans. This is a very complicated question, but a lot of class and race tensions around U.S. bases almost anywhere in the world. Risks of environmental contamination, a lot of chemicals being used, a lot of radiation such as depleted uranium being used in the firing ranges. And I think in Asia in particular, some of the status of forces agreements that allow soldiers or Marines or airmen who've been accused of sexual assault, of rape, of other crimes, are not subject to local justice and are taken out of the country when there's an accusation. And that has really caused incredible tensions with the local population, as well as the issue of women who are being prostituted for U.S. forces and now for private contractors. And in particular in places like South Korea, historically in the Philippines, but now extending into places like Iraq and Afghanistan. So this was the situation in the Middle East in only 1989, not that long ago, where there were U.S. bases in Turkey, naval bases before the civil war erupted in Somalia, Greece. Not a huge presence. The British had had a large presence, they had withdrawn. But since 1990, we've had these new clusters of military bases in this zone from East Central Europe through to Pakistan, from Poland to Pakistan, left behind after each of the military interventions. So when we look at the interventions, it's not just a matter of deploying forces, of bombing, of committing violence. It's also what's left behind after the intervention. And I think that increasingly the Pentagon itself sees that as the critical element. Are we building the bases in order to wage the wars, or are we waging the wars in order to leave behind these bases? So the bases that the wars leave behind are as important as the wars themselves. And this was only the 2002 statistics of 725 significant bases in 38 countries. That obviously in 5 years erupted quite a bit. So the Central Command has an interest in this region from Sudan up to Kazakhstan, where there's 65% of the world's oil, from which the U.S. imports nearly 20% of its needs, Western Europe 43%, and Japan 68%. So in other words, the United States is not dependent so much on oil from this region. Venezuela, Nigeria, Canada, there's much more of an oil supply. The interest of U.S. bases in this region is not to actually get oil for American consumers, but to control this spigot of oil for the emerging economic competitors of the United States, the European Union, and both China and Japan, which are very dependent. China less so. There's some increasing Chinese involvement, but definitely Japan and Western Europe are very dependent on Middle East oil. And for the U.S. bases to be there, I believe, is one of the strategies of controlling the supply of oil, the oil economy. So of course we saw the Gulf War in 1991, and that left behind a cluster of bases in Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, Bahrain, Fifth Fleet headquarters, Qatar, Central Command headquarters now, UAE and Oman. The U.S. supposedly has withdrawn from Saudi Arabia and redeployed in Iraq after the invasion, but in fact there are quite a few communications facilities, Air Force facilities still in Saudi Arabia. The series of wars in former Yugoslavia that I'm actually teaching about right now, and primarily in Bosnia and Kosovo, left behind supposedly as peacekeepers large U.S. bases, first in Bosnia and then after 1999 in Kosovo, including Camp Bondsteel, which is not only for patrolling the American sector in Kosovo, but has also been used, and I talked to some of the vets at Coffee Straw, and a lot of them have been to Camp Bondsteel coming to and from Iraq. So it's become almost a lily pad for jumping off to Iraq. So after the Yugoslav wars, we have bases left behind in Hungary, in Bosnia, in Kosovo, for a while, in Albania, Macedonia. And so you've got this new Europe, this area of East Central Europe in which there's a U.S. presence in the former communist bloc. Of course, the Afghan wars, a whole series of bases not only in Afghanistan, but also in neighboring countries, in Kyrgyzstan, in Tajikistan, and notably in Uzbekistan, and some secret bases left behind at Air Force installations in Pakistan, and notably raids now, obviously, into Pakistan, the war in Afghanistan spilling over the border, but also a U.S. presence. And of course, that's involving the U.S. in this very complicated ethnic, religious, tribal mix in both Afghanistan and Pakistan. Again, whether or not it's direct control over the oil supply or gas supply, Afghanistan has been critical in the whole great game over where to build pipelines. Are they going to go through Turkey, the proposed U.S. route, which has actually been built, through Iran, through Russia? This is the geostrategic game at the time. And U.S. bases, I think, play an inordinate role in securing routes of these pipelines through, for example, Georgia or Afghanistan. When the Afghan conflict is over, we will not leave Central Asia. We have long-term plans and interests in this region, and its countries will be given assistance in exchange for concrete steps. So here's that cluster, not only in Afghanistan, but some of the neighboring countries of Central Asia. So obviously we're moving into Iraq, that quite a few observers, even from the beginning, saw was to get American troops in the region to become the main American military base in the region. Jimmy Carter himself said there are people in Washington who never intended to withdraw military forces from Iraq. The reason was to establish a permanent military base in the Gulf region. So this was the original plan, is to keep 6 large bases in Bashur in the north, Talil, Al-Assad, Balad, the one I showed you, as well as at Baghdad. And again, I think that the withdrawal of military forces and the redeployment primarily to Kuwait, these people are not necessarily coming home. There are still deployments from Fort Lewis going to Afghanistan. There are also new deployments going to Kuwait, returning to that situation where Kuwait became the base from which to, let's say, target insurgents. It would be this time in Iraq if there's another Shia rebellion against the government, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the presence of contractors, the presence of drones, I'm not so sure about this withdrawal from Iraq. But here's the picture. Since 1990, these are the different clusters of U.S. military bases that have been left behind. And it really gives you a sense of why so much attention to Iran and Syria at the present time. Because if you brought in Iran, and there were U.S. bases before the Shah was overthrown in Iran, if you brought in Iran in particular, it would provide a contiguous belt of countries hosting U.S. bases, almost a new American military sphere of influence in this very critical region between the European Union and China, Japan, Russia. And it's almost like, I tell people, it's almost as if you have all of Johnny Cash's CDs except for 2, right? And you're going to do anything. You're going to go on eBay. You're going to do anything to get those last 2. And so I think a lot of the attention on Iran in particular is because of this regional strategy that cuts across administrations. So some of the things that, concluding some of the things that are happening that are maybe changing the basing system is more small forward deployments, more base access agreements where it isn't permanent stationing of troops, but troops like in the Philippines can be there at any time if the government approves. And I think that's what was not set up successfully in Iraq. It might be in the future. Obviously the massive privatization of security, a less sprawling and less visible presence, in particular families not going to join the soldiers, Marines, Airmen, to not provide this very visible large American community. It means that a lot of families within the military are being separated from each other, a lot more than they used to be. And also a redistribution of bases away from places where they've been very unpopular. Germany, Saudi Arabia, now Iraq, South Korea, Okinawa, they've been thrown out of Ecuador. Very unpopular in Kyrgyzstan. You have a lot of success in places like Panama and the Philippines, Ecuador, in throwing out military bases. So the pieces are moved around. So moving into East Central Europe instead, redeploying in Kuwait, moving forces to Guam, Hawaii. Instead of Ecuador, focusing on Colombia, now back in Panama, actually. And so these kinds of things make it very important to have an international anti-bases network. We see a lot of that now in South Korea, very strong movements of farmers against the expansion of a base here, against a Navy base at Jeju Island. Very strong movement right now that deserves our support. In Okinawa in Japan, a movement led by women. Cynthia Enloe has written some amazing stuff about women's roles, feminist roles in anti-bases movements in particular. And then the shell game goes on where the Okinawa activists become successful and forces are moved instead to U.S. territory in Guam. And if people in Guam are successful, they end up moving them to Hawaii. And in fact, a large movement against strikers going on against the stationing the Stryker Brigade in Hawaii. And so this really means that there needs to be contact among activists around the world so they don't play this game, they don't pit us against each other, but we really talk about, as Americans, here in the heart of the empire, talking about pulling all of them out and reducing spending for all of them. So the last thing I want to talk about is just some resources. I've been working with John Lindsay Poland and FOR for a while. This is a system that we set up on mapping U.S. military bases and all foreign military bases through Google Earth, and you can actually download the program, and it makes it very easy to see pretty much all of them on your computer. This is actually what it looks like. We've also set up something called Militarism Watch, which is trying to train new researchers to pool the skills of people who have been researching militarism for a while and spread that work around. and get people involved. I've gotten a couple of Evergreen students involved. There are other people who might want to get involved in carrying out research. For instance, there's a need right now about researching the use of Agent Orange in South Korea. That's the kind of thing that a researcher could sink their teeth into. One of my students is looking at depleted uranium at Joint Base Lewis McChord. So this is probably the best source about military bases. Catherine Lewis has come out with an anthology, partly written by scholars, partly written by activists on the front lines. And you can also get a lot of resources from this international network for the abolition of foreign military bases at no-bases.org. That is one of the ways that we keep in touch with each other about the changing strategies. So that's it.
Thank you for inviting me. You know, if you're in DC right now, or if you're around the country and listening to the budget debate about DC, you would get a rather distorted picture of how we got into this budget deficit. You know, because all the talk is about cutting the big entitlement programs like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. And the right wing, you know, is apoplectic, you know, that these programs are out of control, right? But actually, if you look back at how we got into this mess, you have a very different picture. Remember when Bill Clinton left office, the United States had a budget surplus. People, this wasn't that long ago, but we actually had a budget surplus of about 186 billion roughly in the fiscal year 2001. And when George Bush came into the office, the budget deficit started to explode. And I think all of us in this room know why they began to explode. One is the Bush tax cuts, right, that were skewed overwhelmingly toward the wealthy, and military expenditures, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the explosion in the Pentagon budget. And when President Obama came into office, of course, the third event happened, of course, the Great Recession, right? And so the Great Recession, of course, means that the government is collecting less money in revenues and also has to spend money on the stimulus, the 700 plus billion on the stimulus. They have to spend money on TARP, you know, to bail out the banks. So those three events really account for almost the entire federal deficit, basically, the reason why we are in the trouble that we're in today. So all this talk about, you know, cutting food stamps, cutting the WIC program, if you can imagine that, the Women's Infant and Children program is on the chopping block, if you can imagine that. Cutting Social Security, cutting Medicaid, cutting Medicare is really pure fiction, because those programs did not contribute to this deficit. I'm not saying that there aren't some long-range concerns about those programs, which I'll talk about in a second. But certainly they were not responsible for the deficit, okay? I think that's one thing we ought to make very clear to everyone we talk to, that those are not the reasons, and that the three culprits were the Bush tax cuts, military expenditure, especially the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and of course the Great Recession and its result and its consequences. So let me talk about three programs in particular that a lot of the progressives and liberals are concerned about. One is Social Security, of course. I think all of us know that Social Security did not contribute 1 cent toward the deficit. In fact, Social Security contributed to closing the deficit, because basically the federal government has been borrowing money from the Social Security Trust Fund. Social Security, as you know, is a self-financing program. You contribute money, all of us do who work. You contribute money, and then you draw it out when you retire. It's very interesting, you know, I talk to some young people, and they all say, well, Social Security is not going to be around when I retire. Well, that's a myth, you know. In fact, the Social Security trustees report, you know, say that Social Security will be able to pay full benefits until 2039, I believe. Now, what program can you say that about? That, you know, in 30 years, 40 years, it's still going to be around paying 100%. And beyond that, you know, people say, well, Social Security is going to be insolvent after 2039. What they mean by that Insolvency usually means like you just can't pay your bills at all, you got to go bankrupt. Well, that's not what's going to happen with Social Security in 2039 if the present trends continue. If the present trends continue, Social Security will be able to pay 75% of its obligations beginning in 2039. And there's a very easy way to remedy most of that. It's removing the income cap. I don't know if you know what that is. Right now, if you make more than, I believe, $91,000 a year, your Social Security, you don't pay Social Security for any income above that $91,000. Okay? So Social Security financing is the payroll tax is a very regressive tax, if you will. That's not an argument against Social Security because it happens to be, I think, one of the great programs of the New Deal and one of the most successful programs that we've ever had. Okay? So all this talk about, you know, Social Security needing to be cut, the retirement age needing to be raised, it's just, I think it's really obscene if you think about it. I mean, the retirement age right now for people who are retiring today is 66, right? And it's going to go to 67, I believe, in a few more years. I mean, think if you're a manual laborer, right? Think if you're a manual laborer, a machinist, laborer, roofer, you know, you're pretty shot by the time you're around 50, 55, right? I mean, and to expect those people to work beyond 65, you know, to 70, it's just really obscene, I think. I mean, it's just, and anyone who proposes that ought to be thrown out of office, really. I mean, it's just ridiculous. The second program I want to talk about is Medicare, because there's talk about, again, raising the age for which you are eligible for Medicare. It's now 65. They're talking about raising it to 67, okay? 66. They're talking about making big cuts in Medicare. And again, that is really a horrible policy. Medicare, unlike Social Security, has never been self-financing. By that I mean, even though we pay, if you work, you pay a Medicare tax, payroll tax, that was never intended to fully fund Medicare. Medicare has always relied on the general fund, what they call it, just the operating budget of the US government. So when people say that Medicare is, you know, is going to go bankrupt, that's in some ways meaningless because Medicare was never meant to be self-financing, unlike Social Security, okay? Nonetheless, there are problems with Medicare in the sense that we all know we have an aging population, right? And Medicare costs are going to rise, of course, duh. You know, but what people are talking about in Washington D.C. right now makes no sense if you think about it. What they're talking about is cutting the benefits, okay? Making Medicare more expensive for seniors, raising the age in which you're eligible for Medicare. That is not going to solve the problems of Medicare, because the problems of Medicare are intertwined with the problems with our healthcare system overall, right? Healthcare is the Pac-Man of the state budget, of the federal budget in many ways. It is eating up a lot of expenses, okay? If you talk to any healthcare expert, I'm not a healthcare expert, I do know something about healthcare. If you talk to any decent or honest healthcare expert, they'll tell you you cannot solve the problem of Medicare or Medicaid for that matter without talking about the overall problem of our healthcare system. You know, we spend twice as much per capita than any other industrialized country in the world, by the way. Per capita, we spend more on healthcare than any other industrialized system in the world, including France, Canada, which have great systems. And yet, we have 50 million people who are uninsured in this country, right? we have, you know, all the standards of longevity, of infant mortality. We are below countries like Cuba, okay? We are even below, I believe, I think in infant mortality, we were below Venezuela. I mean, there were some third world countries that had better infant mortality rates than the United States has. So when we talk about trying to solve the problem of Medicare, be careful, okay? It has to be done really within the context of solving our healthcare problems. And if you think about it, the Republicans and those people who oppose the Healthcare Reform Act that was passed by the Congress 2 years ago are undermining the very thing that we're talking about. The Affordable Health Care Act, not perfect, it's not perfect. I think most of us would have liked a single-payer system, but in many ways, we can talk about this. And I think in many ways it is an incredible piece of legislation. I would have liked to have seen a single-payer system, absolutely. But there are some great things in this bill, like the expansion of Medicaid to 133% of the federal poverty level. Right now, we have low-income people who do not qualify for Medicaid, okay? Very low-income people who do not qualify for Medicaid. We have families making, you know, $1,000 a month where the parents do not qualify for Medicaid. Under the Affordable Health Care Act, everyone in this country, whether you have children or not, whether you're disabled or not, right now, Medicaid is a program we call, you have to be categorically needy. Not only do you have to be poor, you have to be disabled, you have to have children, or you have to be over 65 and really poor to qualify for Medicaid. Under the Affordable Health Care Act, anybody, regardless of whether they're disabled, whether they have children, so if you are a childless adult, a single adult, if you are poor, you're going to qualify for Medicaid if your income is below 133% of the federal poverty level. And that goes into effect in January of 2014. And between 133% of the federal poverty level, which, by the way, for a family of three, the federal poverty level is $18,000 a year, okay? So you add 33% to that $18,000. That's about $24,000 a year, okay? If you're a family of three making less than $24,000 a year, your children, of course, will qualify, and you will qualify, okay, for Medicaid. And if you're between 133% and 400% of the federal poverty level, 400%, the federal government will subsidize your premium on the sliding fee scale. So that's a really big deal, if you think about it, that the Affordable Health Care Act, even though it's not perfect, it really is a substantial expansion. In our state alone, 300,000 additional low-income people will be eligible for the Medicaid program. 300,000. We have roughly 500,000 people uninsured in the state today. Okay, so that gives you an idea of what a significant step that is. Of course, that will also prohibit insurance companies from denying you because of pre-existing conditions and so on and so on. Okay, there will be no lifetime limits. Right now, you have a lifetime limit of $1 million, I believe. That's the policy I have. There will be no lifetime limits anymore when come 2014. Okay, so my point is that really when we talk about Medicare and we talk about the problems in Medicaid, which I'm going to talk about in 1 second, we really have to talk about the whole healthcare system, that they cannot be solved unless we solve the whole problem of our medical care system. And we can talk, if you have any questions about that, there are ways to address that. You know, healthcare experts will tell you have to do something called global budgeting. You know, you have to provide chronic care management, and there are other ways of containing costs without cutting benefits to people. The last program I wanted to talk to you about is the Medicaid program. Okay, you know what the Medicare program is? The Medicare program is the federal program for people who are 65 and over and who have paid into the Social Security system. The Medicaid program is just as important as Medicare. The Medicaid program is a joint federal and state program that provides, the Medicaid program today funds 2/3 of the nursing home beds in this country. Okay? So if you get old and you need long-term care, the chances are you're going to rely on the Medicaid program once you exhaust your monies, right? You know, nursing home care is very expensive, right? It's $60,000, $70,000 a year. Most people are obviously going to exhaust their savings. Once they exhaust their savings, the only way they'll be able to remain in the nursing home is to apply for Medicaid, and Medicaid will pay for that. Contrary to what many people believe, the Medicare program does not provide long-term care coverage. It's only very limited. I believe it's up to 60 days. But it's the Medicaid program that people rely on. So the Medicaid program in this state, believe it or not, there are 1 million people enrolled in the Medicaid program in this state. 1 million people, including 700,000 children. And the Medicaid program funds half of the maternity the births in this state. Half of the births in this state are paid for by the Medicaid program. So this is a very, very important program, okay? And the state pays half of it. The federal government pays half. The state of Washington pays half. The reason I'm mentioning this program is that the Congress is talking about making huge cuts in the Medicaid program today as we speak. They're talking about, I've heard figures of $80 billion to $100 billion over the next, I believe it's 5 to 10 years. I forgot, it depends. It depends on what the proposal is. But, and that would have a disastrous impact on our state budget. Because as I said, our state has to pay 50%, okay? If the feds cut their contribution, the state has to up its contribution. And as you know, the state does not have the money, okay? And so we are going to see, and I'd be glad to talk to you about the cuts that the governor is proposing. They are horrendous. Let me tell you, the state has already cut $10 billion, that's with a B, billion dollars out of the state budget in the last 3 years. It is now poised to cut another $2 billion. And if they make some of the cuts that are being proposed, I tell you, there are going to be people who are going to die. And one of the cuts they're talking about now, it's not on the table right now, but maybe for the next round of cuts, is to eliminate prescription drug coverage under the Medicaid program. People will die. You know, if an elderly person, low-income person on Medicaid in a nursing home facility cannot get their prescription drugs for their heart or for their lungs, you can imagine, right? That person is going to die pretty quickly. So I'm not saying that cut's going to go through. I don't believe it's going to, but it's on the table. People are talking about eliminating the prescription drug coverage under the Medicaid program. So we have really a lot at stake here. And I really would urge all of you to call Senator Murray's office, Senator Cantwell's office. There is a big movement across the country to save Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid because they were not responsible for the budget deficit. The final thing I wanted to talk to you about, I know I'm running over my time, but final thing I want to talk to you about, and we can talk a little bit more about this in the question and answer. A lot of the progressive groups around this country have gotten together and started talking about how do we talk about these problems? How do we talk about the Pentagon budget? How do we talk about fair taxation? How do we talk about saving programs like Medicaid and Medicare? How do we talk about saving people from having their homes foreclosed? And I just want to leave you with this. This is something we could talk about for hours. But I wanted to leave you with this kind of message that the progressive groups are tired of talking to themselves. And they're tired of just talking to 10% of the population, all those of us who agree with us, those people out there. So what the progressive groups have done is to say we have to broaden our message, okay? It's to appeal to the middle class, the broad middle class in this country, the working class in this country, people who vote. And what they've come up with is an overall message. The overarching message is to save the American dream and reclaim the American dream, right? What is the American dream, right? The American, and that polls, by the way, they've done some polling on this. That polls off the charts. That is the single most powerful message that resonates with the American people. And I think the reason that is really an important sort of message for us who are in the peace movement, who care about the Pentagon, who want to cut the Pentagon budget, is that I think we can use that overarching theme. I'll just tell you a story. My brother, I shouldn't have named him. My brother is a conservative Republican. He's fairly rich. He's not a social conservative. He's a business conservative, right? The Republican Party has social conservatives and business conservatives. About a year and a half ago, he said, I want to talk to you about the war in Afghanistan and Iraq. And I thought, oh God, let's not go there, because we try to stay away from politics in our family. We're a big family, divergent views. And he just went off. He said, Tony, we ought to end these two damn wars. These wars are worthless. I don't know why we're there. And then the final thing he said, which really got my attention, he said, we're wasting our money there. We ought to be investing that money for our domestic needs. This is from a conservative Republican, okay, who is not some wild-eyed liberal. He's actually fairly wealthy, okay? He's sort of a developer. And I've talked to one of my sisters is sort of a independent. She said exactly the same thing. That we're tired of these wars. We ought to bring the troops home, and we ought to spend the money on our domestic priorities. So I would urge you and urge all of us, when we talk about this, we really should talk about the need to refocus our priorities, okay? Dr. Grossman, that was great. What he said is really great about the military bases. We ought to ask people, why are we spending $100 billion on military bases? Why are we not spending $100 billion to bail out people who are being foreclosed on, okay? Whose homes are being foreclosed on. That should be our message, to save the American dream, bring the money back home, okay? Bring the troops back home. And I think as the Occupy, I stopped at the Occupy Seattle. People were withdrawing their monies from JP Chase, whatever that bank is called, JP Morgan Chase, and Bank of America. And the press was covering it, and I think that message, what they're talking about, is really reclaiming the American dream for the 99% of the people who are not benefiting from the economy. So I'll stop with that.
My role is to summarize how military spending is bad for jobs and how we could actually create more jobs by cutting the military budget and converting to a peace economy. My presentation has three main parts. The first part is we know and often talk about the budget trade-offs. Instead of building a nuclear weapon, we can use that same amount of money to hire X number of teachers, okay? That's the budget trade-off thing. The first part of my presentation is not about that. It's about how military spending distorts and perverts the whole economy in terms of how the economy functions as an economy. So beyond the budget trade-offs, it has systemic problems for the economy. Second point is military spending does not create jobs, it costs us jobs because military spending is so inefficient at creating jobs that the same amount of money would create a lot more jobs if we put it into civilian activities. Third point here is that if we want to put people back to work and if we want to recover the economy to be healthy again, we have to create an economy that is peace-oriented instead of war-oriented, and we should be converting from a war economy to a peace economy that not only will meet people's needs, but would function better as an economy. So here's the first point about how military spending significantly distorts and perverts the economy as it functions. Politicians like to campaign for office saying that they want a strong America. And they think in terms of military makes us strong, but they want America to be number one, and we're number one in military spending. These are actually data from the 1970s. The numbers are actually worse now. We're number one in military spending, but in the 70s we were 15th in literacy, 15th in the world in terms of infant mortality, 15th or 18th in doctor-patient ratio, 26th in life expectancy. So how strong are we if we're way down the list, and we've deteriorated significantly since the 70s. Since World War II, the United States economy, and in fact the whole U.S. society, has been suffering from excessive military spending. We have the famous pie chart from the War Resisters League that explains more clearly than the government and mainstream folks say about how much of our money goes to militarism. Actually, about half of the discretionary federal budget does. Social Security is a separate trust fund, has a different revenue stream and different purposes, so that is not really a part of the discretionary money that Congress has to play with. When people talk about military spending, nuclear weapons are not considered military because they're in the Department of Energy, not in the Department of Defense. So this budget from the War Resisters League actually puts that back in. Also, when people get injured in war, that's the Veterans Administration that covers the costs, but that's a separate agency. That's not counted as a military expense. but that's put back into here. And likewise, a lot of our deficit was caused by excessive military spending that we had to borrow for to pay for wars and stuff. And so the military share of the deficit of the interest on the debt is in here. So when you figure that stuff, we're actually about half of the money. After World War II, a combination of powerful political, military, and economic interests pushed the United States into a Cold War. And here you can see Churchill and Roosevelt and Stalin hanging out before the Cold War started. The Cold War allowed the United States to extend our power throughout about half of the world. The Cold War lasted until the Soviet Union collapsed in 1989. In 1976, I discovered this fact. The Norwegian Academy of Sciences studied more than 1,600 competitive arms races that occurred in the last 2,500 years. All except 16 of those 1,600 ended in war. The remaining 16 ended in economic collapse for the competing countries. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1989. The U.S. economy is collapsing as we speak. And we have this process of collapsing, and we're seeing the various kinds of evidence. The conventional wisdom is that we have to keep working for a bigger gross domestic product, GDP, and for economic growth. But not all GDP is good. For example, if I have a factory and I pollute the air and the water, and you're downstream or downwind and you get sick, and you go to the doctor or you die from my pollution has contributed to the GDP because it creates jobs for doctors, undertakers, people who build caskets, you know. So that all adds to the GDP. So that's supposed to be good. But I suspect that we can think differently about that. A lot of people who are very savvy and are very middle-of-the-road mainstream have said some pretty amazing things in prior decades. Decades ago, Arthur Burns was the chairman of the Federal Reserve, not a left-wing organization. It's the creature of the banks. Arthur Burns said decades ago, the economic growth of a nation is a blind concept unless we consider what is produced as well as the rate of growth of what happens to be produced. Also, during the Vietnam War, A. Ernest Fitzgerald, who was one of the top people in the Pentagon for auditing Air Force expenditures, wrote, the spending for blowing holes in the ground in Asia, for overruns on flimsy C-5A airplanes, and for cutting off legs in Army hospitals all adds to the gross national product as conceived by the economists. Such spending increases something called gross aggregate demand, which in turn is said to make jobs. So he could see through it. During World War II, Army General Dwight Eisenhower led the Allied forces to victory in Europe. And he was a war hero. In 1952, running as a Republican, the American people elected him president, and in 56 they re-elected him president. But he recognized the danger of too much militarism, and when he left office in January of '61, his final speech warned about what he called the military-industrial complex. And here's what he said. He said, in the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. This was half a century ago. This was 50 years ago this year. The military-industrial complex employs a very large percentage of our nation's scientists and engineers. The military-industrial complex is so rich that it can pay high salaries to scientists and engineers and bid away the best and the brightest, and the ones that are left over are available then to work in the civilian sector, which does not have as much money as the Pentagon does. The National Science Foundation and the U.S. government's Bureau of the Budget calculated that during the mid-1960s, 2/3 of all the research and development work in the entire nation was funded by the Department of Defense, NASA, and the Atomic Energy Commission. The military-industrial complex is so rich and so powerful that it steers our industrial production in certain directions and it starves other sectors. after World War II, the United States prohibited Japan from rearming. So Japan built up its civilian economy with better science and better engineering and better production of civilian goods. And they beat the pants off of us in the global economy because the United States kept putting our money into blowing things up, and they put their economy into things that they could actually sell on the world market. This table shows a column here about military spending as a percentage of gross national product in 1966. This is percentage growth rate in output per employee 1950 to 1966. And it shows that the United States had huge military spending as a percentage of gross national product, and West Germany less, and Japan was pretty much negligible. Growth in output per employee was not so much by the US, a lot more by West Germany, and a whole lot more by Japan. So we screwed our economy, skewed and screwed our economy at the same time, which is like a two for the price of one thing. While the United States has been slashing funds for education, other countries have improved their education system. And now a lot of other countries outcompete the United States in the world economy and in technical fields. You keep seeing newspaper articles about how other countries' kids are better at math and all this kind of stuff. So the United States has fallen way behind. Other countries make better automobiles than the United States. They strengthen their economies with high-speed trains, which the United States seems unwilling and unable to do. We've opted instead for gridlock, where you have one person per car, and we sit there in the freeway and don't move. Economists and business people keep saying that we are hurting our economy by having such an inefficient transportation system in this country. And you can trace that back to the excessive military spending. The military uses unimaginably huge amounts of petroleum. Think of all the tanks, trucks, ships, airplanes, armored personnel carriers, and everything they use. All of these are horrible gas guzzlers. Here's the original military Humvee thing. They drive up the price of petroleum because they consume so much of it, and with the dwindling supplies we have in the world, just basic law of supply and demand means if the military can demand and control that volume, there's less for the rest of us. It drives the price up. So we pay for militarism every time we put gas in our cars. And you don't hear politicians say that, but that's one of the realities. These things I've been talking about thus far and the rest of the thing are laid out in way more detail in this 100-page report that I wrote in 1977. It's 100 pages, more than 300 footnotes. The numbers, the data, are a third of a century out of date, but the economic principles are still right on. We just need newer numbers from people. I'd be happy, I have several copies here. I'd be happy to lend it to people as long as you can read it and get it back to me, and I want to keep these circulating. So here's point 2 in my thing. The conventional wisdom assumes that military spending is good for the economy, that it creates jobs. And the actual truth is that some corporations get very rich on military spending, but it sucks money out of the economy's productive sectors, creates fewer jobs than if the same amount of money were to be spent for non-military purposes. Richard J. Barnett has for decades been doing just really great writing on these topics. He wrote decades ago, an economic system that works only by turning out products that endanger itself and the planet is literally suicidal. Other economists keep saying that it's a dead end. You're not producing something that's usable, like schools or highways or mass transit or healthcare, all these things that help our society be more productive and more healthy and successful, and that hurts the economy systemically. For about half a century, from the 1960s to the present, economists have been proving that military spending is a grossly inefficient way of creating jobs. The same amount of money spent on other purposes would create more jobs if spent for health, housing, or education. And in study after study that I've seen from the 1960s on, including these two recent ones, one in 2007, one in 2009, education keeps topping the list as to creating the most jobs per $1 billion spent. This was older data from the 1970s, where military jobs were like 75,000, healthcare 80,000, and education 104,000 jobs per $1 billion. And there's all kinds of stuff. This was from 1977. Says every time the military budget goes up $1 billion, there are 10,600 fewer jobs in the country. So to the extent that we're putting money into this horribly inefficient system that creates few jobs per $1 billion, we're sacrificing the larger number of jobs that could have been created if we put it into productive civilian things such as education. And this was back when the Pentagon budget was only $80 billion. It says a military budget of $80 billion causes the unemployment of 844,000 Americans. And it's many times more than that. So now the current military budget is actually causing millions of Americans to be unemployed because we keep putting our money into this very dead-end thing. And again, this stuff is detailed thoroughly in this report. The third point, or the fourth point, third point, in this presentation here is that the military-industrial complex wants us to think that we depend on them for jobs and for healthy economies. The reality is actually the opposite of that, and we could convert our economies away from dependence on military-industrial complex, and we can convert our local economies, and we can convert our national economy. So that's the third point. I started working on this issue in the mid-1970s, and I wrote this in '77, and in 1979 I worked with some people and we introduced some legislation here in Olympia to have the state look into this, and I testified at the committee hearings. In about 1980, I helped create the Washington State Conversion Project that worked on this. But when Ronald Reagan became president in '81, he just started massively building up the military, and it just swamped out the whole emerging movement, which is a nationwide movement toward peace conversion. The economists have been doing for decades input-output studies showing for a certain amount of money of final demand what industries feed into that finished product. And the state of Washington produces things, fish, timber, agricultural products, all kinds of stuff that doesn't really go into airplanes. They don't make airplanes out of wood or out of fish or out of apples or out of wheat. The parts of the airplanes are made in a bunch of other states. So, and countries now, yeah. So we would be better off buying things. If you build a house, the lumber might likely have been here. The electrician, the plumber, the people who pour the concrete, the carpenters, the roofers, everybody, those are local folks. You build a house, a lot of that money comes right out of our community and cycles around. You buy a weapon, and a lot of that is from elsewhere. We need to be converting military bases, we need to be converting military industries and military workers. And the creative and enticing ways of thinking about this that actually are quite practical are to think of these as resources that we could use for other ways. So what do military bases have? They have a lot of land. They might have an airstrip. They might have a dock on the waterfront. They might have housing. They might have classrooms. They might have machine shops for repairing the equipment. What great places to convert to parks, vocational schools, housing opportunities, community colleges, all kinds of things, and light industry, and likewise industrial plants that make weapons can make other things. Workers who have skills can do other things. If you're an aeronautical engineer who can design a wing of an airplane, you can design the blade of a windmill. And we actually have had successful conversions. I grew up in Everett. Payne Field was an Air Force base when I was young. Now it's a civilian air base. The final point I want to make then is we can convert from a permanent war economy to civilian prosperity. It's possible. We need to start now. We need to convince the public, and then we need to convince the government. And this also will help make peace more likely because it takes away the economic incentive for having endless war. So, that's the pitch.